Call the regular meeting of the Eugene Water Electric Board to order for July 5th, 2022. The first agenda item this evening is an agenda check. Is there anybody that has any questions or comments or wants to move anything around on the agenda? If not, then the next item is items from board members and general manager. Matt, anything from you? No? Okay. John B? No. Sonia? Cindy? Frank?
Just wanted to thank Commissioner Borowski for helping with the opening of the emergency water site at the Lane Event Center a few weeks ago. So thank you.
Yeah, I forgot. I totally forgot about that. Yeah, it was a really nice event. It started raining exactly when the media was there and when we were making our pitch, and then immediately following that, it stopped raining. But it was attended by some local elected officials and some neighborhood people, emergency management people, and I got myself a jug. It was great. Thank you.
Good for you. Thank you. The only thing I had was just actually a question of staff on those containers that, is there any way that the commissioners can get some of those and hand them out to people in their wards? Because, I mean, if we have tons of them and I could walk up and down the street and every third or fourth house, there's a lot of seniors in my neighborhood and things like that, and just say, make sure you get one. Because they're not coming to these events, and I don't know another way they could get one.
But I'll have to check on the inventory. The inventory's been up and down through time, and I don't know where we are right now. But I think especially as commissioners do outreach, and I was gonna talk to you individually about starting to do some neighborhood association meetings and things. Probably this fall would be good timing with a lot of the decisions we're making. It would be good if you had either access to or a certain amount of inventory at your disposal, but I'll have to check on what the actual levels are at the moment.
That'd be good. Sonia?
If we were trying to target vulnerable populations, it might be good to work with
Yeah, I mean,
those type of groups, if we were.
If we have an inventory of things that save people's lives, why are they in the warehouse?
Yep.
They should be in the homes. So that's my point.
I think through time, we've gotten inventory in and we've distributed all of that inventory, and then we've reordered as we need to. So I don't know where we are in that cycle. So I'm not sure that we have tons of them to quote you, Commissioner Brown, but I certainly think it's a good idea to have access to it.
Okay. And anybody signed up for public testimony, either in person or on the phone?
Not.
Skip that little preamble. Okay, the next agenda item is going to be the consent calendar. Consent calendar A.
I move to approve consent calendar.
Second.
Second by Carlson. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye and raising your hand. Aye. Passes unanimously. Approval consent calendar B. By Schlossberg, seconded by Carlson. Discussion? None. All those in favor signify by saying aye and raising your hand. Passes unanimously. Thank you. Next item is City of Eugene electrification response. Frank Lawson.
Well, commissioners, good evening. For the record, Frank Lawson, General Manager. You did receive, although I'll admit it was not part of the normal board packet. That was simply because of a number of edits and the work that's going into developing a response for the City of Eugene. To summarize, we received a series of questions from the city on June 3rd. We have put together an internal process to develop a number of things associated with those questions. First of all, we wanted to try to interpret the questions and develop a series of questions that we could develop responses to that would be used not only with the response to the city, but the general public, and more of an FAQ type of approach. And so we've formulated that and also worked across different departments to start to formulate responses to those. We wanted to give commissioners an opportunity to see where those responses were heading. That was the purpose of this meeting. You did receive the initial draft, although like I said, this is still evolving a little bit, and our commitment to the city was to get them responses at some point after this meeting. I was targeting at the end of this week, but would be open to any comments or thoughts that commissioners, suggestions that commissioners may have. The questions themselves touch in a number of different areas. I think based on the questions, there's a recognition that electrification has impacts not just to EWEB, but to the electric system at large. So the regional and in fact the Western grid, based on a number of the questions, and also local impacts. Again, based on a series of questions that we got from them. And so I'd be really just happy at this point, President Brown, if commissioners wanted to offer comments or suggestions or ask additional questions on the process or the responses.
Okay, I will open it up for questions or comments for anybody. John B.
Thank you. And thank you for these responses. The way that I see these and the way that you guys put them together is I see them, the questions as the bumper sticker. And this is actually the thesis or a synopsis of the thesis. This is the cliff notes of the thesis, let's put it that way. Because in some of the things that the city's dealing with on this, you'll hear, and I'll just put it out there, you know, well, if we electrify, then you're just burning coal in Idaho, right? That's the bumper sticker. And this clarifies that more. And I really appreciate that because as a board member, these are things that I've learned over the past year and a half that, you know, it's easy to have a soundbite, but when you start digging into it, it's a much deeper topic. I guess one of the questions that I would have is, beyond the questions that the city of Eugene asked, are there more bumper sticker questions that we could put into this FAQ that would help the conversation as far as climate change and as far as electrification and as far as some of the other issues that our community is dealing with that we feel would be appropriate to put into this FAQ as well?
The simple, very direct answer to that is yes. That's actually the reason that we developed the FAQ approach to begin with, was that we wanted to be able to expand the topic list as things come up. In fact, there's more FAQs. I think there's 18 questions listed, and there were not 18 questions in total from the city. And so some of them we broke up into two questions instead of one, but we really tried to look at this as a little bit of a broader issue. We also tried to remove a bit of the editorializing in the question itself, which oftentimes if you watch different entities operate, there's a whole series of statements within a question at the end, and it's more about the question than it is about the response to the question. And so we wanted to be able to offer responses that had a foundation that we could trace to. So various studies or different things, and that doesn't always lead to a yes or no answer. It leads to an answer that doesn't necessarily draw the conclusion for you, but it provides input to that.
Okay, thank you. Mindy.
That's a really cool. First of all, I like the way you said the bumper sticker question and then that part of the thesis. And also it's a good point about us putting more of our thoughts in that weren't addressed in the question, because you just don't know what questions to ask or what are good questions or what aren't good questions. And so I really appreciate the way that this is laid out. And if there are opportunities for you to editorialize a little bit. I know maybe you're a little hesitant because of our joint meeting last time. But I do think that like, they only know what they know and what to ask. So if there's more expertise or things like as an agency that we would recommend to them, I think that that could be really useful too.
Thank you. I would say that our responses do contain a utility perspective. I wouldn't say that they're editorialized per se, but they approach the responses very specifically from EWEB as a utilities perspective, and that's recognizing that that is different from a city's perspective, or from a certain group's perspective, or from Northwest Natural's perspective, or, you know, there's, this is from our perspective based on what we know is going on within EWEB, what's going on in the region from a grid perspective. So it does have that perspective, but I think we also want to, in particular, avoid taking positions based on those perspectives, and we'll just provide the perspectives and let others interpret that based on whatever decision they're making.
And I would just add one other thing is that I think somewhere in here we mentioned that we are whatever percentage we are and what our goals are. I think really to highlight that too, and that I know that it is in here, but maybe make that a little bit more present, that as a utility, I mean, that makes us a little bit unique compared to some other utilities that have these values and these goals, and that internally we're going to be grappling with too. How do we make that happen on future trends and pressures?
Joanne?
Really appreciate where the sources of the information have been given to. I think it's pretty valuable for those groups to understand that it's not just us creating this information, that it's more widely vetted, and then they don't think that we're, you know, you can trace the source. Anyway, and then two, can we actually see the copy of the original questions? I don't remember. I would like to just see the differences between the two at some point.
The original questions are actually in the background memo.
Oh.
And so, and then that's the left column, the middle column is kind of rephrased, and then.
Oh, that right at the top.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, those were the originals.
To do a side by side. I did notice that, but then I kind of skipped over that and just went down to the question and answer part. Okay, thanks.
Right. And some of the refinement, to your point, Commissioner Carlson, which is a really good one, is that some of the refinement as we go forward, we want to add a little bit more content to the sources piece of it. There's a few places where we quote some dollars or we quote percentages. Those come from sources, but we don't always identify those. Those have been done in different studies and things, but that'll be part of the refinement that we go through.
Yeah. You have any questions or comments? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, John. Can you hear me okay? Cool. I'm grateful that the city has formally inquired with EWEB about the implications of limiting natural gas use. I know this has been, at least from my perspective, a long time coming. I'm glad that we're getting this all written down and provided to the council. And I think these responses will help to reduce misconceptions within the public and among other elected officials. Thanks for the effort on behalf of staff who have put in certainly a number of hours answering these questions. For me personally, the format was a little bit hard to read with the question stated and then referencing something, you know, a couple pages down, but that may just be fine for others. The questions are necessarily narrow, right? You can't possibly, or the answers, you can't possibly provide all the context, but it can lead to questions about the bigger picture. I find myself reading the answer, and it may, for some, bring up additional questions. And so my question for you, Frank, is, are you going to be available for a discussion with the council, or is that in the works of any kind? And I hope we'll continue to offer to make EWEB expertise available to answer questions during council meetings. I think that real-time feedback when they're having the conversation is as valuable and as important as this written statement of responses. That's all I have. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent point, Commissioner McCray. So I will certainly make myself available, as well as staff resources, to the city of Eugene at and when they need that. I do know that they have a meeting coming up later this month that I will plan to personally attend, that has to do with natural gas and electrification. I also think that, so while staff was a bit challenged by this, one of the original requirements was to keep the responses to, I think it was 150 words or less. Now, that has, to your point, sometimes creates another series of questions. And if those are created, then let's capture those as well. That's where this can become more of a living document. But we really wanted to try to be as succinct as we could. We recognize that these are very complicated issues, and they have to be a little bit of the cliff notes as opposed to the entire novel. Otherwise, it won't fit on the rear bumper of your car at some point. It'll wrap around the outside a little like a NASCAR.
And to be clear, that wasn't a criticism. That was just an observation of exactly that. You had to make them short, and I appreciate the effort that went into making them all very succinct.
Yeah, but I think, to answer your question directly, we will offer further response to the city, either in written form if they want to continue a dialogue that way, as well as providing real-time response for appropriate sessions of council.
Thanks.
I'd like to close by just saying, I really appreciate it. I like the answers and everything, but I also need to make sure that what everybody has said is absolutely vetted there, because council's got to deal with police and land use and human rights. They got to be experts in 20 different fields. We get to be expert in just a couple. And I hope that we are available with our resources, both verbally and written, to make sure that when we go down this path of electrification, that we do it in such a manner that we were able to meet their expectations. Because if they go out and think that we can do something that we really can't do, we have to make sure we're staying right in that conversation and making sure they're educated about what is real and what is not real in this movement to do what we're doing. Because I don't want to see us getting into a place where we can't meet their expectations, or it gets, dumped on the utility industry that we couldn't comply. So I think it's important. I like what you're doing, and I want to do it. So thank you very much, John.
Yeah, just a second thing to it, and thank you for availing yourself to the city council if they so desire. I do feel that by putting this out here, we're going to get bumper stickers out of this document. Right? Certain people are going to say, look at this and look at this, and we're going to have bumper stickers that are going to come out of this document, just so we're aware that people are going to come and say, well, EWEB said this in their FAQs, and they may not, and they'll pull one out that will fit their whatever they're trying to advocate for. And so just kind of be ready for that as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, Commissioner. I think anytime you document something that's a complicated issue, especially one where there's some differences of opinion on those types of issues, people can take a response out of context. And so we're trying to provide as much context as we can, but certain things can be lifted in the wrong moments or at the wrong times without that context to pursue a certain purpose or outcome. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that, well, to Commissioner Brown's point, that the city has a very broad set of issues. By having a set of narrow but deep issues, we have a different set of criteria that we're evaluating. For example, I have to sit in meetings with utility colleagues who are wrestling with a grid that's under pressure. And a city council can look at this, and we can look at this from EWEB's perspective and say, well, EWEB can do this. Look at the goals we have. This is simple. At the same time, we rely on a grid that has a whole separate, unique set of challenges with it. And so by bringing up those challenges, we also need, it can be the other way around, which is, well, you're now a climate avoider or climate denier because you're saying there's challenges in your ability to do this. And that's not necessarily accurate either. So we have to be careful on both sides of the context issue. That's why we're trying to be really careful as to how we respond to these questions by saying, yes, there's EWEB issues, there's grid issues, there's customer issues, and trying to balance the whole set of those. But you're right, there are certain things that people will extract for their own purposes. There's also a study online anywhere that will support a counter argument to any of these. You can find a peer-reviewed study almost anywhere that supports a particular case you want to make, but we felt it was important to capture our thoughts as a utility.
Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Just if commissioners do have particular pieces or particular questions about a comment or a statement, like I said, our intent is to respond back to the city, and we'll make those links a little bit clearer in our response, our memo back to the city, which we're planning to send out by the end of the week.
And will this become live on our website as well?
This became live actually today in draft form. This is the draft, but we will continue to refine a little bit and then get a formal document to the city, and commissioners will be copied on it.
So we can let it out.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay,
Thank you, President.
thank you. Next agenda item is going to be number 8, goal number 7, rate design fundamentals from the background. Deborah. Tiered rates.
One piece of it.
What?
I heard two rates.
I use the word tiered rates.
Yes.
Just, I'd say we go back there.
All right, well, good evening, commissioners. My name's Deborah Hart. I'm here with Tia Marie Harwood, our financial services manager, and I think on the big screen, big head behind me, Mary Ann McElroy, our billing operations manager. This is just meant to be a brief overview of rate design fundamentals, and with that, I'm going to kick it off to Tia.
Good evening, commissioners. So tonight we are here to, again, as Deborah said, we're bring just some information about the third step in the rate making process, which is rate design. We will start with a quick overview of the rate making process itself, as well as review EWEB's rate making principles and the cost of service analysis. We'll then provide information on basic rate design forms before opening it up for discussion. So there are 3 main activities that are associated with the process of establishing customer rates. The revenue requirement is the sum of all funding needs from our retail customers to support utility operations. This provides the basis for setting retail customer rates. The cost of service allocation model, or COSA, is the method to equitably allocate the revenue requirements of the utility among the various customer classes. This process provides the basis for rate design decisions and helps to ensure the customer pricing structure aligns with utility costs. Final step in the rate making process is the actual rate design, which incorporates elements of the embedded cost of service analysis along with strategic direction, values, principles, and short and long-term marginal costs. The goal of rate design is to develop rates that align these elements in providing customers with a fair and reasonable price for utility services, and also allows individual customer choice to consume, conserve, or make investment decisions without impacting other customers. So pricing decisions are a fundamental responsibility of the board. And you may recall seeing EWEB's rate making principles in April of 2021. This framework has been established in determining prices for water and electric services. EWEB rates are to be sufficient to meet the reasonable ongoing costs of utility operations, and all reasonable efforts will be taken to make rates affordable for its community owners. EWEB will send efficient price signals to customers that are cost-based and minimize subsidies to allow customers to make investment decisions that are sustainable long-term without unfavorably impacting other customers. EWEB will charge its customers non-discriminatory prices, and customer receiving like services will be treated equally. And last but not least, gradualism is the principle that EWEB rate stability is maintained and to the extent feasible does not shift unnecessarily year to year. So last September, staff brought information on EWEB's cost of service analysis to the board, and I'd like to take a moment to recap how the COSA fits into EWEB's rate making process. COSA is a cost-based analysis that allocates costs among customer classes and provides a unit cost output for use in the rate design process. So again, the revenue requirement provides the basis for setting our retail customer rates. Using the revenue requirement, costs are then segmented into the functional activities performed in the operations of the utility, such as production, transmission, distribution, and customer-related costs. These functionalized costs are then separated and classified by the primary driver for that cost. This provides a basis for using cost allocation for rate design. And the last step in the COSA process allocates the functionalized and classified revenue requirements to the different customer classes. Once costs are allocated, the unit cost by customer is then used to recover the revenue requirement through fair and equitable rate design.
Thank you, Tia Marie. Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Mary Ann McElroy, the Billing Operations Manager. I'm here to provide you an overview of the most common utility rates. For this presentation, we will cover them in 3 groups: flat, block, and time differentiated. Some of these words or concepts may be familiar to you. For this presentation, our goal is to provide a baseline understanding of these basic rate options and increase your familiarity with the terminology used to describe them. I will start with the simplest option, flat rates. This rate is rather self-explanatory. It is a one-size rate for all consumers of this product. Flat rates do not reflect the true cost of the product being consumed. Flat rates tend to be at a higher price to address risks and any volatilities in the production or distribution of the service being offered. Flat rates are more commonly associated with water utilities as the marginal cost of water goes down and there's no delivery charge, where the marginal costs for electricity go both up and down. EWEB does currently use flat rates for a portion of the products and services we provide. For the electric utility, EWEB currently uses flat rates for privately owned customer lighting and City of Eugene streetlights. Green power block rates are also an example of a flat rate. And for the water utility, EWEB currently uses flat rates for fire line services. Block rates are our second category. Blocks can also be referred to as tiered. The concept is the same. The consumption is grouped and priced according to the grouping. For inclining tiers, a higher rate is charged for each incremental block of consumption. For declining, a lower rate is charged. Inclining blocks have been popular in the utility industry because they encourage conservation and efficiency. This means that the more you use, the higher your bill will be. So there is customer motivation to save money and consume less of the service at the higher price. In addition to the unit costs per block, there are also considerations for seasonal impacts and the transitions between different blocks that could also impact the customer bill. EWEB flattened our residential electric rate offerings in 2018, Resolution 1821, because the existing tiers no longer reflected our actual cost and penalized customers who had all electric households. At that time, commissioners supported a collapse of the consumption tiers, agreeing that the tiers acted more as a price penalty for winter heating rather than a conservation incentive. Inclining blocks are still commonly used for both water and electric utilities. However, this is shifting as more utilities are utilizing new technology and ways to better align utility costs with customer preferences that enable greater choice and control over the utility bill. In support of the state of Oregon's Water Management and Conservation Plan, our water utility uses inclining tiered rates currently to demonstrate our commitment to the conservation of this resource, as shown by the table on this slide. The electric utility does apply both types of block rates in some of our general service offerings. Time differentiated rates are the final grouping. Simply stated, these rates are intended to more closely align the cost of the utility with the impacts to the customer. the day is broken out into 2 or 3 periods, for example, peak or off-peak, whereby prices vary by period but remain consistent from day to day. When it costs more to make or acquire the resource, the customer plays an active role in contributing to that higher cost. From the customer's perspective, they are more interested in the inverse option. When the costs are lower for the utility, the costs are lower for the customer. Time of use, TOU, rates are becoming a more popular option for electric utilities. EWEB did a small residential TOU pilot a few years ago. The information on this slide is taken from that pilot, Power Hours Pricing, with a tagline to shift and save. We learned a lot from that pilot. One of the most impactful things was that the pricing signal was not significant enough to get people to change their behavior. And we need to upgrade our meters and our billing system in order to be able to deliver a rate of this complexity at scale. We currently have one commercial customer on an electric time of use rate, commercial large primary, as part of an extended proof of concept exercise. In some places, TOU rates are aging out as utilities face even greater risks and uncertainties in delivering critical services. I read a headline recently that TOU rates solved yesterday's problem. Under these circumstances, utilities are embracing even more dynamic options of time differentiated rates. Here are a few examples. Real-time pricing, RTP. Prices vary frequently, hourly, over the course of the day to reflect fluctuating electricity cost determined by wholesale electricity prices. Variable peak pricing, VPP. The day is broken out into periods of time, peak period, off-peak period, where prices vary by period. In addition, for at least one of those periods, the price changes daily to reflect system costs and conditions. Critical peak pricing, CPP. A period of time in the day is called critical, or a peaking event is identified when the price may increase dramatically to reflect system costs. Critical peak rebate, CPR. A period of time in the day where that same peaking event is identified when customers are paid for cutting back, curtailing on electricity relative to the amount they normally use. To our knowledge, most of these rates are applied at electric utilities. Time of use and dynamic pricing are future conditional options for EWEB at this moment, and we are continuing to watch and learn from how other utilities implement these time differentiated rate structures. It would be a missed opportunity to not speak to prepay, but it does not easily fit into any of the 3 basic buckets because it is not a rate. Prepay is an alternative payment option in which customers buy a dollar amount of electricity and utilities deduct energy usage from that balance as it is used. Consumers receive daily notifications about their balance via phone, email, and/or text message, plus additional alerts when they reach a low or zero balance. They can add money to their account in multiple ways: online, payment location, kiosks. A zero balance results in a disconnection, which typically occurs the following morning. Service is reestablished in a few minutes or hours after a payment is received. Similar to our current best practices, prepay plans can offer protections to ensure that disconnections do not occur on weekends, holidays, or days with extreme temperatures. To quote the Department of Energy, the DOE, prepay has gained growing attention in recent years. The industry is seeing an ongoing interest in deployment of prepay programs around the country. Consumer surveys and market research show that prepay is poised for strong growth in the near term. The growth is being driven by key technology and consumer shifts, including the rollout of advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, other smart grid technologies, the emergence of the empowered consumer, rising consumer interest in energy conservation, and the increased use of prepay options for other services, gift cards and prepaid wireless phone services, as shown as the image on the slide. Although it should be noted that, unlike these examples, electricity is an essential service. EWEB currently uses a form of a prepaid program with our water dispensing station, where a customer can pay in advance for a quantity of water that is dispensed from a self-serving filling station off West 1st Avenue. At the cost of $5 per 1,000 gallons, this is also a flat rate. Currently, prepaid programs are mostly available to electric and gas customers.
Sorry. So we have touched on where there are differences between how rates can be applied to water and electric. And while there are differences, there are a lot of similarities from a financial perspective. We're continuing to look at the near and longer term cost to provide water and electric services. We'll also continue to partner with our operational colleagues in the Power Resources Group to explore how more granular end use data from our smart meters coupled with the more integrated technology, EES, can help us better manage the assets that our customers have invested in. And while rates are a large portion of our financial toolbox, there are others worth mentioning as a part of this discussion. EWEB is looking to incentivize customer behavior. Tools like fees or charges, rebates, loans or credits can also play a role in achieving that outcome. And those options also involve board direction. So working with you all and understanding how these financial tools work together is where we can support your ability to provide strategic direction and how we implement them. In finance, we do focus on the numbers, but that is only that's only a portion of effective rate design and implementation. There's a natural tension between how these numbers interact to tell a story, to answer the strategic questions. For example, the sufficiency principle states that rates must be sufficient to cover utility operations, and that may strain our affordability principle. Or the efficiency principle may drive us to pull out one of those other tools rather than rates to incentivize customer behavior. And this is where the board helps us weigh the options against our values, strategic direction, and the natural tension that exists between those rate-making principles. So this is the last of a three-part series, and we hope that the presentation tonight has provided a basic understanding of rate design, and that coupled with the earlier presentations on rate-making principles and cost of service have provided a foundation for a fairly complex topic. We really do appreciate the board's interest in these topics as rate design and implementation will be an ongoing discussion for the foreseeable future. We're actively working on increasing access and utilization of our smart meter data to help us have better insight about customer consumption. And even with the delay in reaching the mass deployment finish line, we're making progress in translating the data to a useful context. And the recent EES demonstrations for our new technology platform have provided inspiration for how that platform will be able to support operational efficiencies and the opportunity to provide new products and services, some of which could use the rates that we talked about this evening. And finally, as you can see by the theoretical electric products advertised on the slide, we will need the board's direction to ensure we continue to move in the right direction and meet our strategic goal of dynamically synchronizing our supply and demand. And with that, we'd like to open it up for questions. See Frank's hand go up.
Well, I was on vacation, so
Feedback, surprise.
just a little bit of context for the board. You know, why are we starting to talk about rate design? And part of it is that from a timing perspective, it's probably going to be in 2023 that we start to lay out a more specific roadmap around pricing, especially on the electric side. How will we start to look at the fixed charges versus time of use versus some of these other things? And the reason it becomes more of an issue on the electric side is that we're starting to see more dynamics in the supply chain, in the supply. And as this group knows, the prices vary by minute, they vary by hour pretty significantly, by season, and the carbon content also changes by that same kind of dynamic. And if we really want to be able to electrify, if we want to be able to make good resource choices. We're going to have to provide this mechanism that incentivizes consumer behavior, because the consumer piece of it is part of that synchronizing. So probably in 2023, we'll get a lot more specific around a roadmap. We might not implement it at the end of 2023, but it'll certainly start to, because we have we're doing our EES project as well for our enterprise system and some other things, but we will definitely get into a lot more specifics around what this looks like. Just some context.
Yeah, open it up. We've got 12 and a half minutes left, but we are running a little ahead of schedule, so. Sonia.
A couple of quick comments. Appreciate the series of conversations that we've had. Thank you. I do hope that as we look at the more dynamic types of pricing proposals that we really consider equity, as I know you all will, but you're saying again, I mean, people who are, older and not tech savvy, my parents are visiting right now, and I think of them going, I don't even know, why is my bill shooting up? Like, they don't have the ability to deal with some of those pricing models. So to the extent possible that we offer options for people who are very tech savvy and can, mitigate pricing and help with carbon and, meet their values. Also other types of options that people can opt into that meet their needs and capabilities, I think is going to be really cool as we talk about how we dynamically look at all these systems together. And that's not an easy challenge. So I appreciate that you are aware of that and looking into it. Thank you.
And I think that options is a key here, our ability to provide our customers with choices.
I'll jump in if I could real quick. I want to thank you very much. I really appreciate it, having been tiered rates and things like that. We had them when it first started, we got rid of them like that. But one of the things that was really eye-opening to me is we had a time of use study. We were allowed the commissioners to take these little devices home that measured when your consumption was. And we played this little game about whether or not who could play a contest to see who could save most money. And I ended up getting my utility shut off because I owed you $35 that I saved, and you guys put a door hanger on my. But those that haven't done that,
Electricity.
those that haven't done that, that really sold me on how easy it is to adapt behavior modification and just say, okay, don't run the dryer. If that's still available for the commissioners that haven't been able to experience that, have one of those time of use meters put in their house.
Not at the moment, but
I'm just thinking, because it would, for me.
Can't do an analysis. I don't know if, I believe that most of the, if not all the commissioners have a smart meter on their house. But we can do analysis where we look at the time of use, and you can see where the usage patterns are. That data is available, but we don't have a program like that.
But it was, to me, it was helpful, very helpful, and eye-opening, is saying, okay, I can save money just by being consciously aware of it. You get that little meter up there and you look at how much money you're spending, and no, don't turn the dishwasher on, things like that. So, yeah, but thank you very much. I'm looking forward to that. And the other question real quickly is, people have always asked me, how come our flat rate is so low compared to like Lane Electric, but we're 20 something and they're, 50% higher than we are. And well, actually Lane is $50 and EPUD is really high. And is that the equitable thing? I mean, because I know that disproportionately affects the lower income people.
So we have brought that up over my time here at EWEB, and it will be something for the commissioners to talk about, maybe even as early as this fall, whether or not the basic charge needs to change. For some, there is a perception, and for some folks, there is an issue that it does impact some of our low-income households more, but I think we've got some data.
Yeah, I can answer that pretty specifically. We showed that based consumption, there was no differentiation in levels of consumption and income level. So, there were just as many high consumers of electricity that had low income as opposed to, just because you were a lower amount of consumption didn't mean you were lower income. And so, and if you have a higher basic charge, it tends to shift that a little bit to lower consumers. The challenge is, and this may be a good opportunity for the board to discuss this fall, is that across utilities in the Northwest, for the basic charge, you see everything from $0 to almost $60 across utilities. If you would truly align it with cost, you're going to be closer to the 60 than you are to 0. And that's because of all the fixed costs it takes to deliver that first electron. But there is this perception, and a lot of the ones with 0 are the ones that are governed by city councils, by the way, and who don't want to sort of wrestle with some of the issues that I know past boards here have. If you consume less than about 1,400 kilowatt hours a month, you are actually being subsidized by those who consume more than 1,400 kilowatt hours a month. And that's because when you're not consuming that amount, you're not covering all your fixed costs. And so anyway, there's some work to be done, but that's just one basic step that we're going to start talking about in the fall.
Matt, you have anything for us?
Just thanks to the staff for the presentation. It was super clear. Yeah, I appreciate the work that went into that. And I appreciate the kind of chunking out this all this material for us in small amounts so we can digest it. Thank you.
Anything from Mindy or John B?
Yeah, I was intrigued by the prepay, and the thing that intrigued me about it was the opportunity to maybe use prepay to help defer deposits. Those deposits are something that are onerous, especially to low-income people or new businesses. I know when I opened one of my new business, I had to pay $2,500 in deposit that you guys kept for a year, right? And as a new business, that's something that is, cash flow is something that's hard. So if there would be a way that we could say, we need a deposit from you because we don't know if you're a good risk or not. And I understand that. That's a business practice that is time, shown to work. But if you could say, if you go on to prepay and do prepay for a year, that would satisfy our requirement for the deposit. And I would hope that that's something that we could look into, because I know, especially with the housing thing as it is, if you got first months, last months, and if you have to pay a $200 EWEB deposit, if you could parse it as saying, yeah, you have to pay $200, but that's going to go towards your first month's, rather than we're going to keep that for a year, hoping that you'll be good. That would be something that I hope we could look into if prepay isn't an option that we're pursuing.
It is an option that we're very intrigued by and we'll be looking into with our new technology platform. And absolutely, one of the major benefits is that could be in lieu of a deposit.
Good, because that's something that I've dealt with on a business level, and I've known low-income people that struggle with that as well. And so anything we can do to help with equity in that form, whether it be prepay or other areas, I think that's something that I'd like to pursue.
In a prepay arrangement, we are not issuing any credit.
Right.
So why would we need a deposit? And so I think Deborah hit it correctly. It's for us, it's an issue of getting that platform developed and completed. But prepay is definitely one of the methods that's on the plate.
And I would hope that you would not just say, if you're prepay, you've got to prepay forever. Say, if you prepay and you're good, you've got your thing in standing for 6 months or 12 months, whatever our deposit thing is now, then you could roll into a credit type of an account rather than always having to prepay.
Certainly, although many prepay customers, becomes their preferred mechanism. But certainly we have options there for sure.
Mindy, you got nothing there?
And one last thing that I want to put out. I know that we're focusing on electricity for the most part. Obviously, we look at water rates, but looking forward, we've been very fortunate so far on the water side that we haven't had to curtail water, but I think it's coming. So I just want to make sure that we're prepared for that at some point, that we may have to do that, and having a mechanism in place to do that would be beneficial.
Okay, is there anything else you need from us?
Not at this time.
Did you get what you needed?
Got what we needed for this presentation this
presentation.
evening.
Well, I certainly hope we didn't jump into the next presentation. Okay, thank you very much. Okay,
you.
I need to run things by people. We're an hour ahead of schedule. We can roll it, and the next agenda item is 45 minutes. That'll get us back, and we can knock that one out. If that's what they think it is 45 minutes. And what's the will of the group?
Yeah.
Keep moving? Keep moving? Yeah, keep moving?
Yeah, I'm game.
All right. Is that okay with staff that we move you up? We're on it. Thank you. Next agenda item is the long-term financial plans. Capital plan.
Good evening, commissioners and everybody in virtual land. Tonight, we're going to look for some board concurrence and direction on the various inputs to the long-term financial plan in order to begin the process to develop the next proposed budgets and pricing schedules for 2023. It was nice of Deb to do all that massive detail behind the scenes, but we're going to go at a very high level tonight. So Karen and I are going to look at some of the assumptions and things that go into the long-term financial plan and the capital plans. Alicia, our wizard of math modeling behind the scenes, will spend a good deal of time talking about the financial model, how these assumptions impact the expected rates, so we can do those kind of things. And Deb's going to come back up and wrap us up. So Deb again was and team are into the details of the nitty gritty of the financial plan, but I just want to do a high overview of where we're at in the process this year. Last month, we got together and talked about the capital plan in particular, and presented a number of assumptions and principles that go into that plan. We heard some feedback from that. We incorporated that, and now we're back to summarize what we did and to see the impacts from those assumptions, how they flesh out. Couple things that I wanted to talk about tonight to cover. Most of these things were brought to the board in 2021. We brought a bunch of principles. We were asking for more money, essentially in the capital plan, and we're given some boundaries and so forth to go over. A few items just wanted to highlight real quick though. The rate increase boundaries, the limiting the 2 to 4% average annual inflation rates, that remains the same. Overall, there's really no changes to the capital projects, and Karen's going to talk more about that. The board agreed to focus on increased capital funding to address risk-based project spending for resiliency and compliance. That's still the focus of the capital plans. And probably the biggest changes or the differences that we're bringing are a couple items I wanted to highlight. One is the Reberg night, what's presented, the maybe short-term impacts mitigated. So approximately $20 million is in the plan to address any of the things that may come up in the very short term that we would need to do from a dam safety perspective for Reberg. And in at least as early as August, the teams from Generation and Finance will be bringing details about how the 4 options that will be looked at, how those will impact rates per se. So at that time, those rates would be additive on what we're seeing. We felt it was important to really focus on the basic capital planning, the assumptions that go into it, to make sure that we're focused in doing the rest of the things that are necessary. The other thing the board brought up was the concern about supply chains and how does that impact our projects. And again, Karen's going to get into some more detail on that. But kind of the short story is that the teams looked at the capital plans and supply chains and found that there's a relatively short-term impacts on that, the changes scheduling and some things like that, particularly at the end. Again, this backgrounder covered most of the updates in the business and economic assumptions pretty well, and Alicia's going to get into that a lot deeper, I believe. I just want to highlight a couple more items. Again, the board, some feedback from the board last time was concerns around, are we accounting for inflation correctly? The groups went back and took a more conservative approach to inflation and raised the inflation rates, and in some cases extended out a year, was increased in inflation rates. You can see that from the highlights there. Another thing that was added a little different this year, I think, is the electric revenues. EV vehicle load growth is included at a very modest level. These forecasts will likely be adjusted as our IRP evolves and our knowledge of EV and sales of EVs increases over time. So I do believe we've got time to adjust those, but they were factored in this time. And then finally, the electric revenue assumption does not include revenue from Leberg from generation for the next 10 years, assuming any long-term mitigation solution. The Leberg now will take time, so Leberg is removed from those calculations. So at this point, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, concerns, or concurrence with those.
I've got a question, if I may. What's the basis for changing your forward price curve on from 55 to 85 bucks a megawatt? Your last slide.
51 to 85, yeah.
Yeah, 51 to 85. What's the basis for that? I mean, that's a huge swing, and that's got us in trouble. What caused that?
So the forward price curve right now is really elevated, and that's driven by natural gas prices. And part of that has to do with supply chain pressures. Part of that has to do with impacts from the international market, and then part of it has to do just with weather volatility. So we're seeing the near future higher, and then it reverts back down to the mean as you go further out in the plan.
President Brown, we're trading 5 years out, and those are the numbers we're seeing.
So the prices of electricity is going up because of the shortage of gas and things like that, or the gas supply? Thank you. I just was wondering, because that factors into Carmen and everything else and stuff. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we move forward? Yeah.
Yeah, a quick question related to the wholesale price. It's not really related to this conversation necessarily, but I'm curious if we're seeing that kind of increase in wholesale prices 5 years out. Is that driving in investments in new generation in the region?
Commissioner McCray, not necessarily. We are most investments in new generation is driven by organizations' IRPs. And so it may affect some of the choices that they're making, but much of that is driven by either regulatory or carbon legislation or other things. So just because we've seen a little bit of shift in the supply curve doesn't mean that utilities are going out and starting to construct new sites. It's a much more longer term play than that. And so we have seen a couple of utilities that tend to be more long, almost wholesale utilities looking at certain expansion into things like small modular reactors and things like that. But a simple sort of shift in that sort of near to midterm curve is not driving additional expansion at this point.
Great, thanks. And then being a non-expert in capital and financial plans, this all looks pretty sound to me. Thanks for the presentation.
Questions, comments before we move forward?
Good evening, Commissioners and General Manager Lawson. I'm Karen Kelly, Chief Operations Officer for the record. With me tonight online is Wally McCullough, Engineering Supervisor for Water, and Tyler Nice, Electric Division Manager. They will field any questions I can't answer. And last month, they provided a detailed presentation of the respective capital improvement projects last month. So tonight's just going to be an overview to help set the stage for the long-term financial plan discussion that will follow with Alicia. So with over 1 billion in assets at EWEB, how do we know we're working on the right ones? Those are the questions we ask ourselves continuously. And the answer really is around planning, and lots of it. We have the 20-year master plans that are updated every 10 years and turned into 10-year capital plans, which are updated annually. And these are done to meet our customer expectations on the stewardship of their resources. So to do this planning, we must consider employee and public safety, consequence of failure, probability of failure, current condition and operability, anticipated future condition, customer demand and load, both present and future, regulations and compliance, and life cycle costs. Consider all of this while leaving flexibility to address emergent needs and much, much more. To safely meet those customer expectations and EWEB strategic plan with the goals that you see on your screen, which include the completion of all compulsory work, maintaining reliability, and increasing resiliency. So this is a very big task, if I haven't made that clear. So just to recap our goals, again, we complete all compulsory work. This is mandated or must do work. And we strive to maintain reliability by replacing old assets, as many systems are nearing the end of their useful life. Reliability must also include modernizing, finding new ways to increase efficiency and expand our capabilities. And we must do all of this along with balancing capital needs with our regular operations and maintenance needs. And then third, we must also increase our resiliency by hardening our infrastructure and systems, or in other words, decreasing our vulnerabilities, improve our redundancy, and again, create flexibility. The 10-year water capital improvement plan really hasn't changed since last year in terms of the overall projects, but it has increased some in project scope and cost. Wally gave you a good amount of detail in last month's presentation. So again, this is just an overview of notable projects from the scope, schedule, budget view, or in other words, our type 1, 2, and 3 buckets. In type 1 work, we have the compulsory service and pipeline work, emergent and planned minor facility work, information services, and fleet. This includes our normal customer-driven service and development work, as well as main replacements driven by city street projects, including Polk Street, which was approved by the board last month, as well as 8th Street and a project on Crest, Lorraine, and Chambers, both of which are coming to the board in September. Type 1 also includes minor facility work, including the Highland Drive pump station, which the board will see in August. And type 2 includes our base level reservoir and associated transmission main work. And lastly, type 3 is our second water treatment plan. This slide shows the total estimated difference in the 10-year plans between 2022 and 2023. You see right there at the top, we're estimating an increase of 28 million in this next 10-year plan, primarily due to the increase in inflation, which Alicia will discuss later in the presentation. Also impacting our 10-year water plan is the move of budgeted EWEB Enterprise Solution, or EES work, from operation and maintenance back to capital in year 2023, and an information systems, or IS, from operation and maintenance to capital for the 10-year period. The IS funding move is mostly from capitalizing software as a service, where it was previously funded from operation and maintenance budgets. The rest of this slide highlights some of the main differences between the two plans. And just in case you're trying to add this up, it won't add up. It's only notable differences. So first off, we have pipe and service work, which is increasing by about 6 million due to inflation. Next up, which I found pretty interesting, the base level reservoir work. What we learned during East 40th was that we could actually revise some of our estimates. And also if we moved the gap years between East 40th and going to Hawkins Reservoir, that would also reduce our inflation costs. So it ended up being basically a net zero estimated change in cost. Next up is transmission work, which we see about a 1 million increase due to inflation. And then we are expecting a reduction in AMI costs by 3 million with the completion of deployment in 2024. And then second source was increased by 7 million, also due to inflation. And this third slide for water is basically a look at the CIP from the project purpose or driver view and comparing the single budget year of 2022 to 2023. There's an increase of 3 million due to an increase in project scope and cost for developing the Bertelsen property and getting communication equipments out of the headquarters property to support the sale. The increase in IS capitalization of software and inflation also play a role here. Moving on to the electric side, the 10-year plan content and scope also hasn't changed much, but the schedule did a bit due to emergent work bumping out projects in the current year, along with some supply chain issues. So for type 1 work, we're turning up the dial on renewal and replacement in both generation and electric divisions, including regular service and compulsory work. And we continue to watch and utilize our key performance metrics to establish and inform replacement programs for assets, including cable, transformers, relays, poles, fleet equipment, etc. For type 2 work, we are planning to enhance resiliency to meet our highest impact load. And this includes risk-based work on our resilient spine, including substations that are at the end of their useful life, such as Hayden Bridge, International Paper, Thurston, and Curran, and the International Paper turbine overhaul, as well as restarting AMI deployment in 2023 with expected completion in 2024. We continue to manage work to emerging trends, such as meeting new and ever-tightening compliance requirements around dam safety and wildfire planning regulations, as well as seismic standards. We will also be working to include changes expected with increased electrification impacts. Our type 2 work also includes strategic initiatives mentioned in the water section, such as the EWEB enterprise solution, the Roosevelt Operations Center expansion, and the headquarters move out. Our type 3 work centers around Carmen Smith improvements to comply with license requirements. And just want to note again here, as Rod had mentioned, that the 10-year CIP does include 20 million spread out with 2 million per year for the levered near-term risk mitigation measures. But the work happening now in the triple bottom line analysis will add to this amount to meet the long-term project resolution based on board direction later this year. So the total estimated difference between 2022 and 2023 10-year capital plans is an increase of 132 million, primarily due to the increase in inflation, but also from updated engineering estimates, supply chain related costs, and some of the same changes that I mentioned before with IS and EES mentioned in the water section, with costs moving from operation and maintenance to capital, including overhead adjustments. The rest of this slide again highlights some of the main differences between the two plans, and it only lists notable impacts, does not add up entirely. Electric infrastructure is increasing by 71 million due to inflation, increased equipment costs, and updated project estimates. Next, we're increasing AMI by 5 million with the expected completion of the deployment program in 2023 or early 2024. The current delay on deployment has led to increased meter costs from supply chain issues and inflation. Fleet is increasing by 7 million to reduce the age of system and account for inflated prices. And generation is increasing by 11 million, also due to reducing the age of system and addressing inflation. Again, when looking at the capital improvement plan from the project purpose or driver view and comparing the single budget year of 2022 to 2023, there is an increase in the electric plan of 15 million due to project delays from supply chain impacts, shifts in project schedules due to compulsory or emergent work, such as the 2021-2022 International Paper Loop project, and again, the increase in inflation. As with water, an increase in project scope and cost for developing the Bertelsen property and getting communications equipment out of the headquarters property to support the sale plays a role, as does the increase in IS capital needs and inflation. So with that, I would like to thank all the folks involved in developing these capital plans, which includes operations, engineering, purchasing, finance, and I'm sure many others. And we'll open that up for a board discussion.
Thank you very much. Good presentation. A little sticker shock there, but we'll get over it. Questions, comments?
All right, I'll dig in. I've got questions.
Oh, I knew you would. Budget man.
So changing the IS software from operation and maintenance to capital on both the water and the electric side. What drove that? And if it's capital, can it be depreciated differently? Just talk a little bit about that, then I have a couple of.
Would you like me to answer that, Rod? Or Aaron?
I have an answer, but I'm sure you could give a whole one, so.
The change in accounting standards, so that was not something that we decided. That's driven by accounting standard.
Generally accepted accounting standards, there was a change in that?
Yes.
Okay. And then does that affect how we can depreciate the software? Because in the past, software was tough to depreciate.
Yeah, we'll have useful life attributable to the software that may vary depending on the kind of software. If we know we're going to use it for 3 years or 5 years or 7 years, what have you. So yeah, because we're capitalizing it, we will be able to depreciate it for those costs.
So then that could get offset a little bit somewhere else on the depreciation schedule. So for me, anytime I look at a long-term financial plan, whether it's a capital plan or just a long-term financial plan with income and requirements, one of the things that's put in there is risk. And what I mean by risk is what your buffer is. And that's something that we talked about last year. You know, do we have a higher amount of risk, which means higher rates, or a lower amount of risk? And so where is that built into this plan, the amount of extra room that you're putting on these? Does that make sense?
It does, and Alicia is going to cover our contribution margin risk tolerance as soon as Rod hands it off.
Okay, very good. So that gets me started.
Can I clarify the question? Are you talking about how are we managing risk within the periods that we're managing? Or how are we looking at risk from an overall relationship between our ability to borrow, our ability to cover costs,
I guess risk may not have been the correct term. I've used that in other budgetary things that I've seen. There's you can adjust the percentage of risk that you're willing to live with. And by doing that, especially on a multi-million-dollar budget, if you adjust that by 0.5%, that could be $20 million, give or take, so that's what I was talking about. And when I say risk, it's hard because we have risk all through our terminologies.
Right. Now, the one thing that's a little bit different in our industry is that we don't have a marketing risk, for example. We don't have consumer behavior that's going to impact, or, we're pretty immune to economic swings, for example. We do have the ability that we'll talk about later, which is we build in some of that relative to wholesale prices and all those other things through this contribution margin risk factor. But we're not like a retail organization where we would have a lot of revenue risk, for example, because of general economic conditions.
And I think it kind of goes back to when we were talking about turning those dials that we had that discussion before. Where do you turn that dial to figure out where it's right? And that would be in the long-term financial plan at some point, right?
And what you're getting at too is historically type 1, type 2 projects are pretty well known. So you win some, lose some, and over the time it's averaged out. So we don't have like a 23%, margin we add on for the buffer or something like that. That kind of what you're getting at as well. Yeah. Type 3, I mean, these are big projects. And so any, like we were winners on the East 40th project, for instance, but Herman and yeah, that's where you get into those sites that could impact kind of things. But those are the ones we bring back to the board.
Right.
And have more detailed reporting on in the quarter. So hopefully we're touching on those things in the quarter.
Okay, thank you. Questions or comments? I've got a question about your assumption on inflation for non-labor. That's been a sticking point with me. And so we're up 23 million from last year to this year in the 10-year plan because of inflation. But you're only using 3 to 5% inflation going forward. Are you comfortable with that? Costs? I mean, general construction is 20 and 30% in the last 24 months. I mean, how comfortable are you with that number? Because if that doesn't play out, these numbers are going to be even worse.
I'm comfortable from a perspective of looking at history. And again, it's kind of the same conversation where these things average out. I would defer to Deb though. So she's got sources of government labor stats and all those kind of things that they lean on to get those exact numbers.
This was non-labor. Your category was just materials, and what there's when steel's up and anything petroleum based is up, and any construction material is up like off the charts. And
forecasts are, and again, Deb, you can fill in. Forecasts are that those in the long term.
So we see that in various forecasts that inflation will return to something more towards our historical average. This year we did do 3 years of the 5% on our capital, and I do hear you. It's a risk, but to your earlier point, that's one of those dials. When we increase our inflationary assumptions, we put more pressure elsewhere on the plan. And the Federal Reserve has been very aggressive and has continued plans to manage that inflation downward.
okay.
I would say that based on my conversations with Deborah, looking at even past, there were times in the 80s where there was significant sort of volatility in inflationary numbers. Within some of these, you saw over time 2 or 3 year averages where they were within the range that the Fed is going to be aggressive to manage toward. In the long-term financial plan, I think we're pretty comfortable with where those are landing. What you do see is some acknowledgement in the next few years that there's some volatility that's driving some of the more immediate projects. So that's affecting some of our scheduling, some of our, moving the dominoes around, turning the dials a little bit. But in the long term, I don't think that we have any basis to move too far away from what that historical number has been.
Okay, thank you. Matt, do you have anything for the presenters?
Nope, thanks for the presentation.
I don't hear any other information. We still have more.
We're going to do a musical chairs thing.
Yeah.
Mercury.
Alicia is here at the table with me this evening, but we do have the new Fiscal Services Supervisor, Aaron Balmer, who you may recognize from when he was the General Accounting Supervisor. And I'm sorry, and our newest water analyst as well, and the Financial Services Manager. So there's a whole host of finance people to answer questions. But with that, Alicia Voorhees, please.
Okay. Thank you, Deborah.
Good evening, Commissioners. As Deborah mentioned, my name is Alicia Voorhees. I am a Finance Analyst Lead for Fiscal Services. We presented the 10-year long-term financial plans to you in October 2021 was the last time we presented. Since that time, we have continuously monitored the plans. We have the opportunity tonight to revisit the plans with you and provide an updated snapshot. Tonight, we've discussed the current priorities, assumptions, and investments guiding the financial plans, and the following slides show the 10-year outcomes of those plans. As a quick review, for total plans, we assumed a 4% escalation rate for non-labor O&M costs for 2023, and a 2.5% rate the following year, and a 2% rate thereafter for the remainder of the plan. We assumed a 5% escalation rate for capital costs for years 2023 through 2025, and then a 3% rate for the remainder of the plan. The labor assumptions have been indexed to a combination of inflation factors and expected labor market comparators. We've updated the 2022 projected year-end performance and associated cash levels that flow into these metrics. Every spring, we implement an internal process to review and recalibrate our O&M costs to include baseline and service level increases. These increases may be for 1 year, a few years, or the full 10 years, but regardless, the process allows us to establish a new baseline upon which we escalate for the remainder of the time horizon. Also in the spring, we update our sales and revenue forecasts for each utility. Last year for the water utility, we went back to our normal, relatively conservative assumption around consumption as we had been tracking close to pre-pandemic levels. Year to date through the end of May this year, overall consumption was on average 8% above budget across residential, commercial, and wholesale. We historically used 95% of the 5-year average of consumption for the water utility for sales and revenue forecasts and have continued to do so with this plan. This provides for a contribution margin risk tolerance of approximately $1 million per year. Turning to the rate trajectory, prior to last year, we had not had a rate increase since 2016 for the residential water customers and 2017 for commercial customers. Based on board feedback, this plan we are showing you tonight presents a smoother rate trajectory than the one you saw last fall as a result of efforts to refine the plan. We are projecting a 10-year compounded rate increase of 63%. However, excluding second source, the compounded rate trajectory falls to approximately 33% and is within the bounds of inflation rate allowable forecast range. Because of heavy mid-2020s investment and cash flow needs, the initial 6 years rate increases are steeper than the latter 4 years of the plan. As you'll see in a couple of slides later when we show the bill comparison, there is potentially a bit of headroom in the rate trajectory. This plan models utilizing $14 million of rate stabilization funds in 2023 as it allows for us to defer borrowing until we need to use those funds. If we were to have a strong financial year, we can evaluate the use of the rate stabilization funds and potentially use them in a future year, but it allows us to have flexibility and conservatism built into the plan. We are modeling bond issuances of $78 million in 2024, $70 million in 2027, and $21 million in 2030. The higher bond issuances are a result of heavy mid-2020s investments and cash flow needs. Looking at the financial metrics, please note that yellow indicates we are approaching our target. And if we were to see red here, that would indicate we have not met that metric. As such, you can see that all key water financial metrics remain within board policy through 2032. We approach our cash targets in the first 2 years of the plan due to the use of the rate stabilization funds and the initial higher inflationary pressures. We approach the debt service metric target in the second half of the plan due to the large debt issuances in 2024 and 2027, assumed in the plan to fund the second source treatment plan. We've updated the assumptions to the electric utility in a similar manner to the water utility using updated cash balances, a recalibrated 2023 O&M budget, updated capital investments, and updated sales and revenue forecasts. For 2022, a 4% reduction in consumption was modeled due to pandemic impacts. We are no longer modeling a reduction in consumption related to the pandemic, and this is roughly aligned with 2021 actual consumption and 2022 projections. Year to date, through the end of May, retail consumption has been above budget by roughly 5%. Furthermore, this plan now includes future electrification load growth from the transportation sector. We have modeled a conservative growth based on lower than base case consumer EV adoption rate. We are modeling a contribution margin risk tolerance of approximately 15 million per year, which provides for conservative assumptions around risk associated with generation, wholesale market prices, changes in load, as well as credit exposure. There's a similar contribution margin risk tolerance through 2027, and then we've modeled expected condition in years 2028 through 2032. So we're modeling more conservative assumptions in the earlier part of the plan. If you recall from our May board meeting, you approved increasing the power reserve target from 17 million to 21 million due to increasing wholesale price risks. Therefore, in addition to the conservatism built into this plan, we also have reserves available to offset risk. So as we've talked about earlier tonight, this plan assumes an average of $85 per megawatt hour melded mid-seed market price in 2023, decreasing to $60 per megawatt hour in 2032. This plan does not include revenue from Lieberg generation throughout the plan. And as Karen mentioned earlier, the plan includes a $2 million per year Lieberg investment indexed with inflation for near-term risk reduction measures. A triple bottom line analysis for Lieberg is scheduled for presentation to the board in August, and rate impact of the analysis will be presented to the board at that time. Turning to rate trajectory, until last year, the electric utility had not had a rate increase since 2016. We are also showing you an electric plan with a smoother rate trajectory than the one you saw last fall. The plan assumes a 10-year compounded rate increase of approximately 38%, which falls within the compounded inflation rate forecast range. As you'll see in the rate trajectory, there's an assumed Bonneville rate increase every other year of 2.5% for EWEB customers. That's a function of an assumption we use for Bonneville costs increasing every other year at 6%. The actual rate increases for EWEB customers will depend on the final rates from BPA that are expected in the summer of 2023 and would be incorporated in EWEB's rate trajectory with 2024 changes. The last couple rate adjustments have been below that, and if this is the case again for this next rate period, we will then pass on the lower rate increases to EWEB customers. The plan models utilizing 22 million of rate stabilization reserve funds for capital work in 2023 and 2024, as it allows us again to defer borrowing until we need those funds. We are modeling bond issuances of 83 million in 2025, 44 million in 2028, and 38 million in 2031 to fund capital investments. Looking at targets, as you can see, all key electric financial metrics remain within board policy through 2032. These cash is strained throughout the plan starting in 2025, and this is due to our use of cash in the first 2 years of the plan to fund high capital investment years, followed by high debt issuance in 2025 with continued high capital investment years. Despite the high debt issuances, we are not as highly leveraged in this plan. Shown here are the bill comparisons for electric and water separately. For electric, EWEB has jumped from the 7th lowest among the 17 comparators to nearing the highest quartile. That being said, I would like to point out that 6 of the comparators in the middle of the slide all use the same provider for electric. And so the jump year over year is exaggerated to an extent. Also, we do not know what increases look like for these comparators in the coming year. For water, you can see EWEB in the same spot we've been in recent years as in the lowest quartile. They're not reflected here. We have completed analysis incorporating the impact of the second source treatment plant and projecting out to 2032. And the result is that we remain in the lowest quartile among the comparators. This exemplifies our commitment to balance affordability with future necessary infrastructure investments. As it pertains to a combined residential comparison, EWEB remains in the middle of the pack. And so that brings us to board discussion number 3, to get your feedback on the long-term financial plan and revenue requirement impacts.
Sonia. Thank you very much.
Going to the conversation around Leberg. I mean, we know that any of the 4 options has 10 times the amount that's planned in the budget. I mean, I feel like some of these numbers we're looking at are so skewed that it's not even going to be useful to look at. I mean, if our days cash is constrained now, when we bump that in there, it's going to bump that. It's going to bump the debt service coverage ratio. I mean, it's going to impact all of these. Why are we holding off on not putting a higher minimum in there when we're having these conversations now? Is it just literally because next month we're having the conversation and then moving forward we'll have the numbers in there, or is there another reason? Sorry.
Next, I'm looking at Frank who's answering. Really, you are right. The metrics will be strained, but the metric that will be more strained and will result in rate increases is the debt service coverage. So as we correct for debt service coverage, we'll also then be correcting for cash at the same time. We will come back with each of the scenarios, will come back with their own rate trajectory so that you can see that in August.
Yeah, it literally is next month. We also wanted to establish a baseline based on the previous planning mechanisms so that we could basically show this is going to be the impact of Leberg. We do have some feel for it. Leberg is going to stress debt service coverage. Some of that will be dependent on the timing of borrowing for that. We'll have an impact on that, which some of that we can't just stick a number in because the different options that the board will consider will have different timeframes. Some of them even outside of the 10-year window. So we wanted to make sure we flushed through that before we brought it to the board. So our choice was to establish a baseline this month and then highlight what those changes are going to be next month. And I know President Brown mentioned sticker shock earlier.
I would also say, just a reminder, the process is to help set the next year's budget. And so regardless of the choice that's made for Leberg in the next couple of years, next couple of year budgets are not going to be greatly impacted. So what we're really trying to do here is establish that baseline so we can do this budget going to as well.
Okay.
I neglected that in that first slide, sorry.
And then on the debt service coverage ratio and just thinking about inflationary impacts, when we look at the targets that we set, and I think you answered my question, but I'm just going to ask it anyway, just to make sure that I'm on the same page. You said that we reset the target last month or before, for one of them to deal with some of those pressures, because that's a standard number. I mean, this is a set figure that we made a while ago, but now we're seeing inflation, and if this is supposed to cover some level of variance, and now our variance is growing, how do we impact that? So have you done that look on that, and that change that we made addresses it for anything that we need, or are there some of these other metrics that we need to look at based on these other inflationary changes?
So the adjustment that Alicia was referring to was the target for the power reserve, and that is reviewed on an annual basis. And so in there, we're catching price risk, credit risk. And so that was the metric that was updated. We have some conservatism for the other risks in our contribution margin risk tolerance, as well as our inflationary assumptions.
So you don't need to look right now at changing any of these other kind of reserves. Because we have a number of different reserve types.
We evaluate the reserves in the spring before we come to you all with any recommendations. And I don't see significant changes in what would drive target changes that we did not address.
Okay.
in June.
I would just add that over time, Commissioner Carlson, as we review that in the spring, for example, the capital reserve is based on what we see as the annual depreciation roughly for the amount of capital we have in service. If we start to get into massive differences between replacement costs and original costs, that, which is an inflationary input, over time, you might see that that start to increase. As we see wholesale market impacts, which is what was mentioned earlier, as those prices increase, the risk goes up because now, so you have to allocate for that risk. So you'll see those go up or down over time. Inflation will have an impact over time, but not in one particular year and not in how we model it in the long-term financial plan.
Okay. Thank you.
Questions or comments? I got a question or two. So what's 150 million in water in bond issuance in that 5-year span? Is that a second source and the reservoir projects? I'm just wondering generally. Okay. And then what's going to be the balance of our rate stabilization funds after we take 36 million out of it?
0.
So we're going to wipe
Target.
Part of the target.
It'll be target.
5 million and.
That'll be the balance after we take everything out. So we're starting over. We're just kind of taking all that cash out of there. And just a general comment, I've been here for a while and we worked really hard to get us to the left of the curve. And now we're way back to the right on the electric thing. And that's not your fault, but it's disappointing to me because the affordability thing, this is not a commodity that people have a choice on. And, you know, they have to make decisions on, you know, food and everything else. They can't, you know, and here we go again. We're going way forward to the right. And so hopefully we can somehow address this because it's troubling for me to see our rates get where they are compared to everybody else's factor.
President Brown, one thing I would touch on, that it's probably more appropriate to do that kind of analysis at the end of the year or the beginning of the year. We have put in our increase. We have not put in the increase of our comparators. And so, you know, if you were to assume that they're going to be, you know, dealing with the same inflationary factors we are, we would probably end up in roughly the same position. But at this point in time, we have sort of forecasted forward our increase without anybody else's increase.
So the people that are like fully subscribed to the bond bill, they get a 6%, they got to somehow deal with that. And we only have to deal with 2.5.
Right, it's a timing issue. And then most of those that we jumped over were Pacific Core. And I know that they're going to have some significant increases between now and the end of the year as well. So it's a little bit deceiving to do it right now where we're sort of saying our prices are going up, but we're assuming nobody else's is. That's why we sort of jumped past 6 or 7 of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, Sonia hit the nail on the head with, once we throw Lieberg in there, we're gonna, no matter what you do, we're gonna be all the way to the right. I mean, it's gonna be hard for me to say our utility costs or our burden is greater than Seattle.
Lieberg is going to have a significant impact. And it's going to be a known impact.
Yeah. All right, other questions, comments, John B.
Yeah. First comment is on the water rates and the leveling of those. I really appreciate that. When you brought this to us last fall, we were looking at double-digit increases, and I'm really glad that you were able to flatten that curve and make that a little bit more, even though the water, you know, it's a smaller bill, it's still, those were high numbers, and I appreciate you guys taking the input that we gave you and being able to work with those numbers. On the debt service coverage, when you come back next month with Lieberg, will that affect our bond rating if we hit a higher one? And if so, could you bring that assumption back to us as well?
So
Go ahead.
our, what we are working towards is bringing you back a rate trajectory that is compliant with board policy as it is today. So the rates to cover Lieberg will have to be sufficient to cover the debt service. And actually it goes to, as it gets more expensive, it actually is 2 times the debt service to maintain that debt service coverage.
To supplement that just a little bit. So those were established by the board to target certain bond ratings.
Right.
And so if that's where the actual board targets came from. So to maintain that bond rating, to maintain that ability to borrow over time with good rates, that's why debt service coverage is important to maintain that. If the board were to sacrifice that and say, well, instead of 2 to 1, we're okay with 1.75 to 1 or something like that, that would have a detrimental impact on our bond rating, thus driving our borrowing costs up. So that's why we've been very diligent in staying with those particular metrics, because we do know that this kind of business, you are borrowing pretty consistently over time to maintain your assets.
And then, just to going to Commissioner Brown's talk about the rate stabilization. Yeah, we're driving it down to 0, but from what I heard you guys saying, we're over budget on both water and electric assumptions. So some of that, you know, when you do your marginal beginning working capital at the end of the year, some of that could go back into, you know, when we reallocate our reserves, we can choose to allocate those to the rate stabilization, which is what we did 2 months ago. Correct.
Mm-hmm. So we're drawing it down to target. And if the utility has an expected year, as opposed to what we budgeted for with conservatism, that would give us an opportunity to not draw all of those funds out and have them available for future use.
Yeah, that just goes the other opposite of what I just said is you can use it all and we can throw it back, or we can use less and keep it in there. So, yeah.
Recent history, we have been able to sort of replenish those because we have had conditions or spending levels that have allowed us to do that. Throughout history, it has not always been that way. There have been situations where one utility or another has drawn on reserves. So we've been fortunate in recent history to be able to do that, but that has not always been the case.
My last question is, so this is a long-term financial plan. Is it updated every year, or when will it be updated again?
It'll be actually updated in October for you all. And so this is the big refresh for this year for you all, but we monitor that year round.
But you're going to build your base, you're going to build your budget off of this one.
Going to take feedback from you all. There will be some updates. There will be some fine tuning as the capital budgets get loaded. We'll refresh prices. And so your direction coupled with any changes that we see in our assumptions is what we'll come back to you all with in October.
Thank you.
Commissioner Borowski, for staff, it's pretty much a living document. Now, we will also bring back next month some of the impacts of Lieberg. Again, garnering direction. And then when we get into, okay, here's the rate direction, then we'll bring it back again. So it's going to be pretty periodic.
But as Rod said, if you bring back a $200 million Lieberg project, that's not going to, we've got 2 million built in for Lieberg for next year's budget. We're not going to start throwing rate increases for Liebergs in our next year's budget.
Well, the only exception would be if the board wanted to be more proactive with knowing that sooner rather than later. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but the board could decide and, well, hey, we're looking at least a $200 million bill starting at some point down the road. We might as well get started sooner rather than later. That could impact the board's discussion, but Rod's right. I mean, historically, this has been used to set the next year's budget, and there's really no other reason other than a board wanting to be proactive with Liebert to do that, to change that.
Sonia?
I'm curious about so, I mean, we have inflationary costs that are out there we're projecting. I guess I encourage us to look at, are there certain projects that we could push out and think that right now we're dealing with these costs that are just going through the roof. I feel like at some point it's got to tip over the other side. We're getting inflation. We're probably going to go into a recession. Are we going to get to the other side of that and have costs go down and maybe some of these projects are better to hold for a bit? Or do we think that, no, it's just going to keep going up and up and up, and it's better to get them in now before the cost continues to go up? And obviously that's a very difficult question. I mean, that's the crystal ball sort of question. But as we have so many projects that are on our plates, I think it may be worthwhile to have a discussion around that. If we think there might be an opportunity for some of those costs to get to the other side of it and be in a better buying position, whereas right now we're just at the mercy of everything.
There's some kinds of inflation that are, I guess, called sticky inflation, which tends to only go one direction. It tends to go up at greater or lesser rates. It doesn't tend to be indexed to a commodity that comes back down. I would say part of the reason that you see numbers that are somewhat dampened, they're not fully to the dynamic extent that we're seeing right now, is that we do recognize that there's kind of a long-term play in this. If there's always going to be inflation, the more you put off a project, the more expensive it's going to be. The only exception to that would be if there's negative inflation. And there could be some projects where we would look at that might have a very high content of a commodity, which, you know, copper or steel or something that we might say it could be worth the risk to look at this in 2027 instead of 2025. But generally speaking, the further out to the right you go, the more expensive it
And
gets.
it's like with the water plant that we moved down the road, now it's $20 million more expensive. Okay,
Right.
I just wanted to hear that.
The exception
Again.
to that, it really is an important point, that the exception to that is if we're pushing up against metrics that we just physically can't afford to do.
That's
So, and
what I'm worried about.
those are the dials that Rod and Karen talk about when they say there's risk-based projects. Those are the ones that you can turn the dials on. There's compulsory, there's strategic, and then there's risk-based. And some of those you might just have to say, gosh, we are pushing up into a period that's very difficult for us to afford. And the other piece of that is, do you have the resources to be able to execute on those? So there's a number of dials that will probably have to be turned.
Other questions or comments, Matt?
Yeah, a few things. Thanks for the conversation. This has been super helpful. I'd like to reiterate Borowski's comment about flattening the curve on the rates for electric. I'm sorry, for the water rates and bringing those down, smoothing them out a little bit. I also wanted to point out, and I think it was said earlier, for Brown, you brought up our rate or the cost of electricity compared to others and how it's jumped from the lower quartile to the upper quartile. But that whole line, it's very flat, right? So we don't have to move up very much for it to leapfrog past like 6 different utilities that all pay the same amount. So it's, for me anyway, it doesn't bring me a ton of heartburn. I feel like we're in a good spot there. I have a couple of questions. One is, over what time period would we be likely to finance a Lieberg project? Is that a 30-year loan? What does that look like?
So typically, if you were to borrow for that, I'm thinking that would be a 25 to 30-year repayment cycle. Depending on which alternative the board selects, that will determine when that borrowing occurs, whether it's within the 10-year window or outside of the 10-year window. I mean, either way, you have to address it in your long-term processes. But Typically, you would bond that at a 25 to 30-year period, if I'm correct, Deborah.
30 years, but ballpark.
Yeah, the pros and cons, if you could extend it out as much as possible during opportunities of good rates, good borrowing rates, then that sort of has a positive impact on your customers, especially if they were gaining benefit during that time, which in this case they're not. Depending on what the borrowing conditions are at the time, we're going to have to evaluate the period of which we're repaying those bonds.
Okay, thank you. And then, I mean, it seems to me like the interest rates are especially good right now compared to what they're likely to be a year or two from now. It's interesting that we brought up the topic of, starting to put money towards Lieberg. I'm curious the downside of doing that. Like, to me, if we can extend that and begin chipping away at that fairly large expense, that makes sense to me, but I'm curious your thoughts about the downsides of doing so.
So I guess the downside of, rephrase the question, the downside of doing it sooner rather than later?
I was starting to put money towards Lieberg, whether it's taking out the loan now, I don't know if we can even do that if we're not actually doing the work, or starting to just put money aside, knowing that we're going to have that large expense in the next 5 years that we're going to have to start working on.
Yeah, well, I think the downside is it puts a burden on your customers, potentially at times that are favorable or unfavorable. We know that our customers are coming off of a COVID period. There's now some forecasts that there could be recessions in the next couple of years. And do we want to hit them at a time of recession, or would we want to wait until there's some recovery after that? So it would be really more of a board decision around at what point do you want to start placing that burden on the customer base.
I'd add that we do have, with respect to the question about borrowing earlier, we do start a clock for how long we have to spend down bond funds, which is why one of the reasons why in these plans you see chunks of borrowing that as we spend down, we'll borrow more, and that's what the Lieberg, those are what I expect the Lieberg alternatives will look like. It won't be all borrowed at once. The yield curve is flat, so rates are going up now, and they're higher than they were the last time we borrowed, but we don't see them continuing on a steep trajectory. We are talking with our financial advisor from Piper Jaffray in the next couple of weeks, and part of that discussion will be some strategy around borrowing as well.
Great, thanks. I do hope that if it seems like there's an opportunity or an advantage to starting that payment or borrowing early, that we'll have a chance to chew on that. And I appreciate all the diligence among the whole team, just weighing all of these factors and helping us to understand it. Thank you.
Paquito, go ahead.
Yeah, just on this electrical and the comparisons, in the past, we had that rate targeted to our area of median income as well. That would be helpful, because you said you put us up against Seattle. Well, yeah, in Seattle, they're making 1.5 to 2 times what we're making here. So if that chart could be put in there.
That was in the backgrounder, Commissioner, and we're about 3.5%. What our utility burden is roughly 3, and that's a combination of the electric and the water costs relative to your median income.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you need anything else from us?
Well, I had a conclusion slide if Alicia wants to advance, but we've answered a lot of questions. The plans here were developed to adhere to the key financial metrics, manage rates to inflation, and address the investment priorities that Karen outlined earlier. The combined investment to achieve the strategic and operational goals is just over 900 million for both utilities combined over the next 10 years, with 100 million of that right now in 2023. The average annual rate increase, excluding the second treatment facility, stays at 2.89%, and for the electric utility, 3.25. And so this evening, we were just looking for any further guidance from the board as we moved into fall to develop the budget and pricing proposals.
Okay.
So,
Well,
thank you all.
We'll wrap it up and go from there. Now it's, we're behind the break, so you're done. And you guys want to take a 5-minute break, or we got about 50 minutes scheduled again? We have Carl with 30 and then a couple 20s, they're 10s. What do you guys want to do? Break for 5 or go?
You just go, but
I'm good going.
Maybe.
Bill of the board.
The board is okay with it? We'll just keep going.
Carl is okay with that. You're the president.
He's not here, he can't.
Thank you.
So we good to go?
Good to go.
Okay, roll it. Thanks for having me on this, what looked like a long evening, so I'm glad you guys are cutting into that time. So this is just another update for you on our watershed restoration efforts, and really just focusing on the funding side of things mostly. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. And I'm just putting this slide in. I know you've seen it many times, just to remind you of the different, of our plan and the different kind of buckets of work that we're doing. The near-term risk-based work is in full fledged right now. It'll start leveling off and over the next year or two. And that's really getting at erosion. And really our focus is revegetating riparian areas that are in steep and burned areas. So that in order to do that, you need to control invasives, you need to get rid of fire fuels that might impact those areas. So our protecting that investment is really first and foremost for us. But there's also water quality monitoring and other things as part of that risk-based efforts. And then the resiliency, you're on the tour, you saw a lot of work, a lot of tributary work happening starting this year, and then the acquisitions. The strategic is really an opportunity to acquisition, start looking at carbon sequestration as a way to manage those lands for carbon in partnership with the University of Oregon. It's true, this is a little bit outdated. I apologize for that. People are on vacation, so I couldn't get this updated. So really, like the agreements are up to 130 right now. Invasive vegetation, we're over 32, 35. People's work is starting to wind down. Just to give you a sense of, this is the work that's being done with the properties upriver that have come in through the Pure Water program. So really the meat of the slides are these. So I want to kind of talk through this graph real quick. I know it's kind of busy, but obviously the funding sources are on the left. So this slide shows you kind of what we've spent to date. And so these are funds that have either come to EWEB and reimbursed our costs, or there's funds that are just cost share or go directly to the grant. So they don't actually they're not repaying us in any way. So for example, the FEMA funds you see there, that 1.3 million, that is, so that cash is not in hand yet, but Congress did approve that payment. So we should get that. That's for reimbursement for our emergency response work. So you see that money flows by the color of it from the left to the actions on the right. So it's I know it's pretty busy, but it's hard to represent all this money in a way that hopefully you guys can get a grasp of where things are going and what they're going for. I want to highlight the Pure Water Partners. This is basically doing business as Cascade Pacific RC&D, and you approved that consent item earlier this year. That's where money is going out to our partners that are doing the work on the ground. So they're working with the landowners, they're designing the work, then assigning the work to our contractors, which you can see down below. And then that work is done and they manage that work. So really this is the wheel that makes everything happen. The next slide is really looking forward. And so a lot of these funds are still in play. They're not for sure or in hand. For example, you know, the big piece that is coming in that's obvious is the septic assistance money. So the money that is for sure that we have in hand is Business Oregon that the legislature approved at 1.5 billion flowing to the county, then to us through our septic assistance program. The DQ funds is one that is RFP out for a grant that we're submitting to a request for 1.7 million. And that money has a little bit more flexibility to it. And so that's not for sure, but that, I'm just trying to represent kind of the things that are in play that we feel pretty confident or good about. The other piece on here is the FEMA funds, which is a hazard mitigation grant planning grant. So we don't know, we haven't heard yet on this one, but good early on feedback that this was something that they were interested in funding. Those funds are basically flowing through to pay for pure water program. That's so I'll kind of talk through how these funds are being used in the next couple of slides. And let's see here, I think that's, stop me if, I guess we'll go back. I'm sure you will. So that FEMA box that I just highlighted, this planning money, is basically, this is an example of an area where we've worked with a lot of landowners that's starting to make a contiguous area. And these colors on here, I didn't want to put legends, they're really kind of meaningful to us. For example, the red boxes are burn assessments that were done early in the emergency response phase. There are different phases of, as we built the database that we're tracking all this work and the GIS piece of it. It's different versions of that database moving through time. So the blue is the more recent version 3 or 4 that we're in. So it's just a way that we're tracking this work and who we've touched. So it really, unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot of meaning, much meaning for you guys as it does for us. And so basically the FEMA funds will pay for us to take an area like this where we have contiguous landowners and design a restoration across all those tax lots or parcels. And then basically do the effort to do the design and get it ready. And once it's ready, then we submit it for a project grant. Then FEMA pays for implementation of that work across all these. So that's what that FEMA planning money is going to be used for. This is another area just to show you the Blue River area. These are all the property owners we're working with. And the FEMA funds also pay for us to kind of fill in those gaps where we have it's contiguous mostly, but there's a couple landowners that we can just fill those pieces in and make a more complete picture. So that money is also used for outreach and trying to sign those folks up and do work to get them in the program. So we have 7 of these focus areas that we're working on. And I'm not going to show you all 7, but those are just 2 examples of how that grant is going to work. In the resiliency bucket of work, I know you're familiar with this now. This is a picture of South Fork. You've seen this slide a number of times. I just want to kind of refresh your memory once more. You've seen Finrock Phase 1. You've seen Deer Creek, South Fork. You've seen this slide many times. This is the future work that's in 2023, the Finrock Phase 2 and Quartz Creek, and the ones that are future on that. So these are, we also have a FEMA design grant for the floodplain work. Starting, if we're successful to get that grant, starting to do those designs and those projects. So this is the kind of the crystal ball projection, kind of our crazy slides. It really just shows you how the partnership works in a way. In order to get as much money as we can leverage for these projects on the right, sometimes money has to flow through trust, sometimes it flows to us, sometimes the Forest Service gives it to us, and then we send it to someone else. So, so this is the FEMA money down here is another one that we're waiting to hear on. But this is a project grant, so this is going for work that's already been designed and we're getting permits for, and Quartz Creek and Finrock too. And if we don't get that grant or it gets reduced, we do have other options. For example, up on top is the Berkeley DeFazio funds that were through appropriations. So those funds are going to flow through Finrock Phase 2. So we have some wiggle room there if FEMA decides to dial back. We're not as successful. It will have an impact if we don't get the FEMA money. It's not dire end of it. I did want to talk through this Forest Service money because you're going to be seeing that coming before you over the next couple of months. And so Forest Service we have a master agreement with the Forest Service where they can push us money or we can send them money. So in this case, they're going to be sending 750,000 to us. And then we'll be combining that money with Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board money to do the street project, which basically is slated for sourcing large floodplain. There's times where we are sending money to the Forest Service, and you'll be seeing one of these, they're called SPA, Special Project Agreements with the Forest Service under the master agreement. We are paying for like their engineers to work overtime because, you know, they only have so many FTE, but yet they're supporting all these projects. Really, it's more funding their staff to work on our projects. Otherwise, they're not going to give our projects priority. They're the ones that have the expertise to do this work. On that NIFWIF on the left, that's basically a placeholder. That's that bridge money when we were out on Quartz Creek, and basically the Willamette National Forest had this as their top priority to replace that bridge we're standing on. And the region took that money out and sent it back to DC, so we're out that money. So there's 3 different options we're looking at right now to replace that money that was lost. And the 2 of them basically have it flowing through us. And then it goes to the Forest Service, and then they do the work, they manage the contracts, but we're to basically be able to get this funding, it has to be a utility or somebody other than the federal government. And I just wanted to highlight the Carmen Smith, obviously funding going for the Deer Creek Plain Restoration Project, and also talk about the Carmen Smith a little bit, the T-line, transmission line work they're doing is going to be a source of large wood that will then flow to the creek. There is some good coordination between us and the work we're doing. And I think, I think I'll just stop there. I'd like to point out that for a land acquisition, leverage with, or is being leveraged with 3. And show you how let's do it some more.
Appreciate it. Questions or comments?
I love the funding charts. I really do. I love seeing where it came in, all the different groups that we partnered with and where that money goes. I know it's complicated, so thank you for organizing it this way, but I really appreciate this. And I hope that if we have, if we're able to have any of those neighborhood meetings, that this can be a reference one if we get comments or questions about, you know, I just remember our upriver meeting last year. Why are you working with all these people? And it's like, well, we can do a lot more. Here's why. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Well, Adam
That's all I have.
Spencer is the one that made these graphics, and he's awesome. That's all I got to say.
Okay. Well, give him big,
Yeah, definitely.
big high five for me.
Back on that earlier, somebody commented that of like a loan. Utility world, but parts and how many partners we have. There are not other utilities that are doing this work. I think it's meaningful and shows the impact, really like the magnified impact of what we're doing. I also really
Matt?
Matt had to say it though.
Yeah, but these charts are kind of remarkable. This is the busiest, hardest working chart I've ever seen in my life. But it seems reasonable given your team is also the busiest, hardest working crew, and this is the busiest, hardest working partnership I've ever seen. I don't know how you do it all, Carl, and I know there's a bunch of people working with you, but I also recognize your leadership as an individual and how much you contribute to, pointing the direction for the whole crew. Really appreciate all the effort you put in here to keep this moving and all the funds that are being applied to make our watershed, more resilient and our water better. And anyway, it's remarkable. Thank you for the work and thanks for this overview.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and your staff. And being the liaison to the Watershed Council, I get to see a lot of these projects a little bit more in detail. and the good work that's going on, and the recognition that EWEB has with all of those partners that are up there, all of those little logos really appreciate what we bring to the table. At least that's how they represent it. And I really think that we need to invest in a ankle monitoring bracelet that will shock Carl if he ever even thinks about leaving the organization. His grant writing and his team's grant writing abilities are up there. And so I really appreciate what you're doing. I know the people upriver appreciate what you're doing, and all the people that you're partnering with there. It really shows when you get to sit in some other meetings. Appreciation that they have for EWEB, and I think we help to leverage, because that's what this all is. It's none of these groups could do it on their own, and us having the ability to be either the conduit or the person that can put us over the ledge is really important. So thank you very much.
I guess I would just like to point out that one of the key staffs that we hired, Keegan, was amazing. So we hired a grant specialist. And I've never worked with someone in the grant writing scheme where you're always up against a deadline and stressed out. And she's so calm, and just like you feel, oh, you'll be okay. Anyway, she's awesome.
All right, thank you Thursday for.
Carl, thank you very much. Comment and question. The comment is, and I know that you have been had my finger on that septic fund for years, and it's not going away. So I expect you to spend every penny of that, and then we'll get you some more. But I think, knowing how many of those septic tanks up there were failing before this catastrophe and things such as that, I really appreciate that we've got a lot of money there and we can take care of that, because that's a huge threat to the. And then my question is, knowing that we own thousands of acres, but a significant amount of timberland along the Beaver Canal, and that's owned and reserved for the purpose of protecting the integrity. Now that the canal may not be around, have we given any thought to trading any of that? I know there's some pretty significant timber companies that have really high interest in that. Trading that and, and maybe put limitations on just pre-commercial turning and now clear cutting and things like that, for some of the lands that may be more critical in watershed recovery efforts.
I haven't really thought about that. It's generations land. The source protection program manages that for us for conservation. Amazing, 80, 100 feet, so for a timber company.
I know. But I'm just thinking about resources.
They're negotiating with Campbell Blue. I'm not sure I'm ready to start negotiating another timber.
Well, you're different with different people. I'm just the thought process that we have a pretty significant resource up there that was.
Well, I guess actually and Susan, you probably hear more. Yeah, the Department Smith is mitigating their credits and then using a portion of LEPR. Some restrictions there.
Yeah, they're writing that in right now. They're writing it into their wildlife mitigation plan that they'll submit to FERC. So they're using not all of it, but a good percentage. I think it's like 80% of the land for their wildlife mitigation plans. So yeah, Department Smith is.
Reach. Okay. Thank you. Well, that's it. And then well, thank you very much. And I'll
give it the 10 minutes. So I was just trying to.
Yeah, you did it. You did it. You ball out of the park, and I echo that thing about the ankle. So there may be a little significant. There may be a horse sitting in bed or something, but you're not going anyplace for a while. All right, no comment. Thank you very much for doing such a wonderful job and representing so well and doing that. You really appreciate it. Thank you. Next agenda item, correspondence and board agendas. Frank.
President Brown, thank you. There were 7 items of correspondence this month, so we appreciate the board's diligence. All of those were informational, except one asked for some guidance, and this can be provided either this evening or when we have our one-on-one check-ins, and that had to do with the new commissioner orientation. There were some changes with that, so if you have any feedback on that, you can provide those to me either offline or this evening. There was one item of correspondence I just wanted to make special note of, and that was, as most of you know, Kelly Hale joined EWEB about, I don't know when, a month and a half ago or something. And one of the things that she included in here was EWEB's role in the city's Climate Action Plan 2.0. And one of the pieces of that that you'll notice is that we have segmented out and identified where EWEB is both explicitly called out or just maybe implicitly would be impacted by the different elements of the plan. We also identified where there are items in the plan that we are working on, and the actions that we'll take with that will we'll report those quarterly. So if it's in the CAP 2.0 and we are working on it, it will get reported. We are also working on things that may not be in the climate action plan, and those will be reported on a different interval, maybe annually. So we tried to segment this out, and then there's some things that may be in the plan that we're not working on, and we'll continue to monitor those. But we wanted to be pretty clear with the board and the public where we are working and what results we're getting. And then went through the different sections of the plan, building, electrification, transportation, et cetera. And EWEB is identified in certain paragraphs or chapters. So it's given an ID and highlighted as to what we're doing. So wanted to thank Kelly for kicking that off. And there are a number of different departments around the utility that are now involved in that tracking and that work. So I think Kelly's going camping tomorrow. She's probably listening, but anyway, wanted to thank her for that and just point out that as one of the highlights of correspondence. And then other than that, I would just be open if you had any questions on any of the other items.
Question on that, share that with.
We have not shared this particular summary with the city of Eugene specifically, other than if they were to go out and read it on the website. We will interact with them in a number of different ways over time, including our quarterly meetings and just periodic updates. We will likely do something like this where we do a kind of more of a full report out.
I don't even know if the city of Eugene has anybody in that.
I'm not sure if they do or not.
Maybe at your, ever you have your meeting or whatever that happens. It might be interesting to share it with the.
We'd love to. We're into like September, October,
Yeah.
time to schedule our second meeting. They just can't seem to make it a priority. So we've gone through, Tony and I have given them tons of iterations and yeah, they just keep saying, oh, I didn't work. What does?
And we'll make sure we share it with the various appropriate.
Okay. That then we'll do board wrap up. Let's go around the room. Matt, anything for the good of the order? Right.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I also wanted to call out that memo by Kelly Hale. That's that framework that she's put together is really helpful, I think, for all of us to kind of understand how things are fitting together and where there's more work to do and where things are getting done. So thanks to Kelly for that. And really, all of the correspondence items, there's so much in our packet that really keeps us all aware of what's going on. And I just want to acknowledge all the effort that goes into things that we don't even spend a whole bunch of time talking about during these meetings, but keep us all up to speed. So thank you to staff for all the work that goes into those. And then also to the technical staff that makes this hybrid system run. It's pretty flawless. It's working really well. So thank you all for the effort to make that function. That's all I have. Thanks.
Sonia.
Nothing. I'll catch up with Frank.
Just want to thank the board chair for getting this out early.
Two things real quick. You don't have to get back to me now. It's a long time ago, we had an asset allocation on who owns what at the headquarters. And when it started out, the conversation was 86% water for electric. And I was just wondering if you could get back to me on that, how that's going to work on the headquarters building when we get that money, which department's going to get it? Because, you know, sometimes the percentage changed and I'm going to be fighting for water. And who gets the money? You can just get back to me on that. The other thing is, we had a request and a head nod to get a 4-hour meeting before they leave our decisions amongst us. And can we on that? Because this is July and I think August is going to be a big meeting.
This is going to be a big meeting. It is in the, on the calendar, something that we need to schedule. So I'm going to work with staff and provide some options for the board.
Yeah, if we could get that sooner than later, because that's trying to carve out 4 hours amongst 5 of us is not going to be easy. Anything else from you, Frank?
Just one thing. I did want to thank Rod Price and the executive team. I was actually on vacation for 2 weeks and appreciate all the help from Rod and the team. A lot of it reflected in this meeting, so it was great materials and great presentation. So thank you very much.
There were no outages at all the whole 2 weeks you were gone.
I guess I'll see you later.
Rod approved our request for the meeting in Maui for. You see that come across your desk?
We did not.
See, there are checks and balances built into the system.
It's just a rounding function, come on.
Rod also approved the purchase of an anklet for Carl, I think.
I got the buzzer.
I think Carl's are already, oh, never mind.
No, I know.
Creeped out.
No, you can tell. All right, no worries that. All right, anything else for the good of the order? If not, then I'm just gonna adjourn this meeting and take over. Thank you very much. Sorry, this